Jordan the Alchemist Peterson, Sam Dogma Harris. In this video, I'm going to go over Jordan as the alchemist and Sam as someone worried about dogma, basically inspired from their first and second debates, as far as I can remember. And I've brought up this idea of Jordan the alchemist before, but I continue to walk around it, as Jung says, circumambulate this idea, and I'm getting closer and closer, I think, to what it means for us as people interested in Jordan's ideas. I think I've lingered here on this slide long enough to get it as a thumbnail. So yeah, the idea here is to point you to the source of Jordan's ideas about dogma and culture, creating, quote, Christians from atheists, by quoting Jung's Aion. And again, I want to continue to get closer to the center of this idea about Jordan being the alchemist. So I have some notes here for you to follow along, because I do have notes for myself, so I don't wander off topic too much. So Jordan the Alchemist Peterson is misunderstood by atheists and theists alike. Jordan the Alchemist Peterson is seen as not getting his materialist philosophy quite correct. He's confused at best, or maybe he's confusing the general non-scientific public. Jordan the Alchemist Peterson is misunderstood by theists in that they think he's confused about religious points of concern, like, does God exist? Did Jesus resurrect? And so forth. Or at worst, he's just a coy atheist, maybe. Or, God forbid, he's just a Jungian regarding God. Here's a quote from the longer passage I'm going to read from Jung. Faith lacked experience, and science missed out on the soul. Jordan the Alchemist Peterson is bringing us this unity once more to our modern minds, having been ensconced in the largely materialist worldview. He is taking the science of today and pointing it inwards, where it finds only darkness, chaos, and that which is not an object. This is where the story ends for most. Science is not an inward-looking tool. It looks outward, as Northrop Frye says. The primary function of mythology is to face inward toward the concerns of the society that possesses it, which is why science, which faces outward towards the operations of nature itself, is a late cultural development. Yet this is where things get interesting, and it is where Jordan the Alchemist Peterson starts to bring into our time the resonating words of Carl Jung. We feel this before we understand it. We know it. We always knew it. Because we always have to know. We always have to have something of the thing we wish to incorporate into us already in us. It is like finding like, one finding itself. And Jung aptly put it, all cognition is akin to recognition. The guide he uses to explore the center of man is narrative. The stories that built the world up for man, the stories that at the most fundamental level are man. The biblical narrative serves as a useful guide for science to explore the, quote, architecture of belief. And this is where Jordan the Alchemist Peterson has us on the edge of our seats. We wait with bated breath to see, where does this science, this psychology guided by the torchlight of myth, lead us? Is it leading us to God, to enlightenment, to a dead end, or something we don't know yet how to conceive? Perhaps something that is not a thing, that cannot be abstracted and fit into this narrow cave of our minds, trapped in this circle of bone on this planet of rock, in this space of the mundane shell, cavernous in length, breadth, and height. And with that, I'm going to open up Aion, which Jordan often references. And there's about 10 pages in here that I think once you get into it, you're going to find it very rewarding. Quote, "The old master saw the alchemical opus as a kind of apokatastasis, the restoring of an initial state in an eschatological one. The end looks to the beginning, and contrawise. This is exactly what happens in the individuation process, whether it take the form of Christian transformation, quote, except ye become as little children, or a Satori experience in Zen, quote, show me your original face, or a psychological process of development in which the original propensity of wholeness becomes a conscious happening. For the alchemist, it was clear that the center of what we would call the self does not lie in the ego, but is outside it, in us yet not in our mind, being located rather in that which we unconsciously are, the quid, which we still have to recognize. Today we would call it the unconscious, and we distinguish between a personal unconscious, which enables us to recognize the shadow, and an impersonal unconscious, which enables us to recognize the archetypal symbol of the self. Such a point of view was inaccessible to the alchemist, and having no idea of the theory of knowledge, he had to exteriorize his archetype in a traditional way and lodge it in matter, even though he felt, as Dorn and others undoubtedly did, that the center was paradoxically in man and yet at the same time outside him. The incorrupt medicament, the lapis, says Dorn, can be found nowhere save in heaven, for heaven, quote, pervades all the elements with invisible rays meeting together from all parts at the center of the earth, and generates and hatches forth all creatures. Quote, no man can generate in himself, but only in that which is like him, which is from the same heaven. We see here how Dorn gets around his paradox. No one can produce anything without an object that is like him, but it is like him because it comes from the same source. If he wants to produce the incorrupt medicament, he can only do so in something that is akin to his own center. And this is the center in the earth and in all creatures. It comes like his own from the same fountainhead, which is God. Separation into apparently dissimilar things, such as heaven, the elements, man, etc., was necessary only for the work of generation. Everything separated must be united again in the production of the stone, so that the original state of unity shall be restored. But, says Dorn, thou wilt never make from others the one which thou seekest, except first there be made one thing of thyself. For so is the will of God, that the pious shall pursue the pious work which they seek, and the perfect shall perfect the other on which they were intent. See therefore that thou goest forth such as thou desirest the work to be which thou seekest. The union of opposites in the stone is possible only when the adept has become one himself. The unity of the stone is the equivalent of individuation, by which man is made one. We would say the stone is a projection of the unified self. This formulation is psychologically correct. It does not, however, take sufficient account of the fact that the stone is a transcendent unity. We must therefore emphasize that though the self can become a symbolic content of consciousness, it is, as a superordinate totality, necessarily transcendental as well. Dorn recognized the identity of the stone with the transformed man when he exclaimed, quote, transmute yourselves from dead stones into living philosophical stones. But he lacked the concept of an unconscious existence, which would enable him to express the identity of the subjective psychic center and the objective alchemical center in a satisfactory formula. Nevertheless, he succeeded in explaining the magnetic attraction between the imagined symbol, the theoria, and the center, hidden in matter, or in the interior of the earth or in the North Pole, as the identity of two extremes. That is why the theoria and the arcanum in matter are both called veritas. This truth shines, quote, shines in us, but it is not of us. It is, quote, to be sought not in us, but in the image of God which is in us. Dorn thus equates the transcendent center in man with the God image. This identification makes it clear why the alchemical symbols for wholeness apply as much to the arcanum in man as to the deity, and why substances like mercury and sulfur, or the elements fire and water, could refer to God, Christ, and the Holy Ghost. Indeed, Dorn goes even further and allows the predicate of being to this truth, and to this truth alone. Quote, further, that we may give a satisfactory definition of the truth, we say it is, but nothing can be added to it. For what, pray, can be added to the one? What is lacking to it? Or on what can it be supported? For in truth nothing exists besides that one. The only thing that truth exists for him is the transcendental self, which is identical with God. Dorn was probably the first alchemist to sum up the results of all the symbolical terms and to state clearly what had been the impelling motive of alchemy from the very beginning. It is remarkable that this thinker, who was far more lucid in his formulations than his successor, has remained completely unknown to historians of philosophy until today. He thus shares the fate of Hermetic philosophy in general, which for those unacquainted with modern psychology remains a closed book sealed with 7 seals. But this book has to be opened sometime if we wish to understand the mentality of the present day, for alchemy is the mother of the essential substance as well as the concreteness of modern scientific thinking, and not scholasticism, which was responsible in the main only for the disciplining and training of the intellect. Mater Alchemia could serve as the name of a whole epoch. Beginning roughly with Christianity, it gave birth in the 16th and 17th centuries to the age of science, only to perish unrecognized and misunderstood, and sink from sight in the stream of the centuries as an age that had been outlived. But just as every mother was once a daughter, so too was alchemy. It owes its real beginnings to the Gnostic systems which Hippolytus rightly regarded as philosophic, and which, with the help of Greek philosophy and mythologies of the Near and Middle East, together with Christian dogmatics and Jewish Kabbalism, made extremely interesting attempts from the modern point of view to synthesize a unitary vision of the world in which the physical and the mystical aspects played equal parts. Had this attempt succeeded, we would not be witnessing today the curious spectacle of 2 parallel worldviews, neither of which knows or wishes to know anything about the other. Hippolytus was in the enviable position of being able to see Christian doctrine side by side with its pagan sisters, and similar comparisons had also been attempted by Justin Martyr. To the honor of Christian thinking, it must be said that up till the time of Kepler, there was no lack of praiseworthy attempts to interpret and understand nature, in the broadest sense, on the basis of Christian dogma. These attempts, however, inevitably came to grief for lack of any adequate knowledge of natural processes. Thus, in the course of the 18th century, there arose the notorious rift between faith and knowledge. Faith lacked experience, and science missed out on the soul. Instead, science believed fervently in absolute objectivity and assiduously overlooked the fundamental difficulty that the real vehicle and begetter of all knowledge is the psyche, the very thing that scientists knew the least about for the longest time. It was regarded as a symptom of chemical reactions, an epiphenomenon of biological processes in the brain cells. Indeed, for some time, it did not exist at all. Yet all the while, scientists remained totally unaware of the fact that they were using for their observations a photographic apparatus of whose nature and structure they knew practically nothing, and whose very existence many of them were unwilling to admit. It is only quite recently that they have been obliged to take into their calculations the objective reality of this psychic factor. Significantly enough, it is microphysics that has come up against the psyche in the most tangible and unexpected way. Obviously, we must disregard the psychology of the unconscious in this connection, since its working hypothesis consists precisely in the reality of the psyche. What is significant here is the exact opposite, namely the psyche's collision with physics. Now for the Gnostics, and this is their real secret. The psyche existed as a source of knowledge just as much as it did for the alchemists. Aside from the psychology of the unconscious, contemporary science and philosophy know only of what is outside, while faith knows only of the inside, and then only in the Christian form imparted to it by the passage of the centuries, beginning with St. Paul and the Gospel of St. John. Faith, quite as much as science with its traditional objectivity, is absolute, which is why faith and knowledge can no more agree than Christians can with one another. Our Christian doctrine is a highly differentiated symbol that expresses the transcendent psychic, the God image and its properties, to speak with Dorn. The Creed is a symbolum. This comprises practically everything of importance that can be ascertained about the manifestations of the psyche in the field of inner experience, but it does not include nature, at least not in any recognizable form. Consequently, at every period of Christianity, there have been subsidiary currents or undercurrents that have sought to investigate the empirical aspect of nature not only from the outside but also from the inside. Although dogma, like mythology in general, expresses the quintessence of inner experience and thus formulates the operative principles of the objective psyche, i.e. the collective unconscious, it does so by making use of language and outlook that have become alien to our present way of thinking. The word dogma has even acquired a somewhat unpleasant sound, and frequently serves merely to emphasize the rigidity of a prejudice. For most people living in the West, it has lost its meaning as a symbol for a virtually unknowable and yet actual, i.e. operative, fact. Even in theological circles, any real discussion of dogma had as good as ceased until the recent papal declarations, a sign that the symbol has begun to fade, if it is not already withered. This is a dangerous development for our psychic health, as we know of no other symbol that better expresses the world of the unconscious. More and more people then begin looking around for exotic ideas in the hope of finding a substitute, for example in India. This hope is delusory, for though the Indian symbols formulate the unconscious just as well as the Christian ones do, they each exemplify their own spiritual past. The Indian teachings constitute the essence of several thousand years of experience of Indian life. Though we can learn a lot from the Indian thought, it can never express the past that is stored up within us. The premise we start from is and remains Christianity, which covers anything from 11 to 19 centuries of Western life. Before that, there was, for most Western peoples, a considerably longer period of polytheism and polydemonism. In certain parts of Europe, Christianity goes back not much more than 500 years, a mere 16 generations. The last witch was burnt in Europe the year my grandfather was born, and barbarism, with its degradation of human nature, has broken out again in the 20th century. I mention these facts in order to illustrate how thin is the wall that separates us from pagan times. Besides that, the Germanic peoples never developed organically out of the primitive polydemonism to polytheism and its philosophical subtleties, but in many places accepted Christian monotheism and its doctrine of redemption only at the sword's point of the Roman legions, as in Africa the machine gun is the latent argument behind the Christian invasion. Doubtless the spread of Christianity among barbarian peoples not only favored but actually necessitated a certain inflexibility of dogma. Much the same can be observed in the spread of Islam, which was likewise obliged to resort to fanaticism and rigidity. In India, the symbol developed far more organically and pursued a less disturbed course. Even the great Hindu Reformation, Buddhism, is grounded in true Indian fashion on yoga, and, in India at least, it was almost completely reassimilated by Hinduism in less than a millennium, so that today the Buddha himself is enthroned in the Hindu pantheon. The historical development of our Western mentality cannot be compared in any way with the Indian. Anyone who believes that he can simply take over Eastern forms of thought is uprooting himself, for they do not express our Western past, but remain bloodless intellectual concepts that strike no chord in our inmost being. We are rooted in Christian soil. This foundation does not go very deep, certainly, and as we have seen, it has proved alarmingly thin in places, so that the original paganism in altered guise was able to regain possession of a large part of Europe, and impose on it its characteristic economic pattern of slavery. This modern development is in line with the pagan currents that were clearly present in alchemy and had remained alive beneath the Christian surface ever since the days of antiquity. Alchemy reached its greatest efflorescence in the 16th and 17th centuries. Then, to all appearances, it began to die out. In reality, it found its continuation in natural science, which led in the 19th century to materialism, and in the 20th century to so-called realism, whose end is not yet in sight. Despite well-meaning assurances to the contrary, Christianity is a helpless bystander. The Church still has a little power left, but she pastures her sheep on the ruins of Europe. Her message works if one knows how to combine her language, ideas, and customs with an understanding of the present. But for many she no longer speaks, as Paul did in the marketplace of Athens, the language of the present, but wraps her message in sacrosanct words hallowed by age. What success would Paul have had with his preaching if he had had to use the language and myths of the Minoan age in order to announce the gospel to the Athenians? We overlook the unfortunate fact that far greater demands are made on present-day man than were ever made on people living in the apostolic era. For them there is no difficulty at all in believing in the virgin birth of the hero and demigod, and Justin Martyr was still able to use this argument in his apology. Nor was the idea of a redeeming God-man anything unheard of, since practically all Asiatic potentates together with the Roman emperor were of divine nature. But we have no further use even for the divine right of kings. The miraculous tales in the Gospels, which easily convinced people in those days, would be a petra scandali in any modern biography and would evoke the very reverse of belief. The weird and wonderful nature of the gods was a self-evident fact in 100 living myths and assumed a special significance in the no less credible philosophic refinements of those myths. Hermes ter unis, Hermes thrice one, was not an intellectual absurdity, but a philosophical truth. On these foundations the dogma of the Trinity could be built up convincingly. For modern man, this dogma is either an impenetrable mystery or a historical curiosity, preferably the latter. For the man of antiquity, the virtue of the consecrated water or the transmutation of substances was in no sense an enormity, because there were dozens of sacred springs whose workings were incomprehensible, and any amount of chemical changes whose nature appeared miraculous. Nowadays, every schoolboy knows more in principle about the ways of nature than all the volumes of Pliny's natural history put together. If Paul were alive today, and should undertake to reach the ear of intelligent Londoners in Hyde Park, he could no longer content himself with quotations from Greek literature and a smattering of Jewish history, but would have to accommodate his language to the intellectual faculties of the modern English public. If he failed to do this, he would have announced his message badly. For one, no one, except perhaps a classical philologist, would understand half of what he was saying. That, however, is the situation in which Christian charismatics finds itself today. Not that it uses a dead foreign language in the literal sense, but it speaks in images that on the one hand are hoary with age and look deceptively familiar, while on the other hand they are miles away from a modern man's conscious understanding, addressing themselves at most to his unconscious, and then only if the speaker's whole soul is in his work. The best that can happen, therefore, is that the effects remain stuck in the sphere of feeling, though in most cases it does not even get that far. The bridge from dogma to the inner experience of the individual has broken down. Instead, dogma is believed. It is hypostatized, as the Protestants hypostatized the Bible, illegitimately making it the supreme authority, regardless of its contradictions and controversial interpretations. As we know, anything can be authorized out of the Bible. Dogma no longer formulates anything, no longer expresses anything. It has become a tenet to be accepted in and for itself, with no basis in any experience that would demonstrate its truth. Indeed, faith has itself become that experience. The faith of a man like Paul, who had never seen our Lord in the flesh, could still appeal to the overwhelming apparition on the road to Damascus, and to the revelation of the gospel in a kind of ecstasy. Similarly, the faith of the man of antiquity and of the medieval Christian never ran counter to the consensus omnium, but was on the contrary supported by it. All this was completely changed in the last 300 years, but what comparable change has kept pace with this in theological circles? The danger exists, and of this there can be no doubt, that the new wine will burst the old bottles, and that what we no longer understand will be thrown into the lumber room, and as happened once before at the time of the Reformation. Protestantism then discarded, except for a few pallid remnants, the ritual that every religion needs, and now relies solely on the sola fide's standpoint. The content of faith, of the symbolum, is continually crumbling away. What is still left of it? The person of Jesus Christ? Even the most benighted layman knows that the personality of Jesus is for the biographer the obscurest item of all in the reports of the New Testament, and that from a human and psychological point of view, his personality must remain an unfathomable enigma. As a Catholic writer pithily remarked, the Gospels record the history of a man and a God at the same time. Or is only God left? In that case, what about the Incarnation, the most vital part of the symbolum? In my view, one would be well advised to apply the papal dictum, "Let it be as it is, or not be at all," to the creed and leave it at that, because nobody really understands what it is all about. How else can one explain the notorious drift away from dogma? It may strike my reader as strange that a physician and psychologist should be so insistent about dogma, but I must emphasize it, and for the same reasons that once moved the alchemist to attach special importance to his theoria. His doctrine was the quintessence of the symbolism of unconscious processes, just as the dogmas are a condensation or distillation of sacred history, of the myth of the divine being and his deeds. If we wish to understand what alchemical doctrine means, we must go back to the historical as well as the individual phenomenology of the symbols, and if we wish to gain a closer understanding of dogma, we must perforce consider first the myths of the Near East and the Near and Middle East that underlie Christianity, and then the whole of mythology as the expression of a universal disposition in man. This disposition I have called the collective unconscious, the existence of which can be inferred only from individual phenomenology. In both cases the investigator comes back to the individual, for what he is all the time concerned with are certain complex thought forms, the archetypes, which must be conjectured as the unconscious organizers of our ideas. The motive force that produces these configurations cannot be distinguished from the transconsciousness factor, known as instinct. There is therefore no justification for visualizing the archetype as anything other than the image of instinct in man. From this one should not leap to the conclusion that the world of religious ideas can be reduced to nothing but a biological basis, and it would be equally erroneous to suppose that, when approached in this way, the religious phenomenon is psychologized and dissolved in smoke. No reasonable person would conclude that the reduction of man's morphology to a four-legged saurian amounts to a nullification of the human form, or alternatively, that the latter somehow explains itself. For behind all this looms the vast and unsolved riddle of life itself, and of evolution in general, and the question of overriding importance in the end is not the origin of evolution but its goal. Nevertheless, when a living organism is cut off from its roots, it loses the connections with the foundations of its existence, and must necessarily perish. When that happens, anamnesis of the origins is a matter of life and death. Myths and fairy tales give expression to unconscious processes, and their retelling causes these processes to come alive again and to be recollected, thereby re-establishing the connection between conscious and unconscious. What the separation of the two psychic halves means, the psychiatrist knows only too well. He knows it as disassociation of the personality. The root of all neuroses. The conscious goes to the right and the unconscious to the left. As opposites never unite at their own level, a superordinate third is always required, in which the two parts can come together. And since the symbol derives as much from the conscious as from the unconscious, it is able to unite them both, reconciling their conceptual polarity through its form and their emotional polarity through its numinosity. For this reason, the ancients often compared the symbol to water, a case in point being Tao, where yang and yin are united. Tao is the valley spirit, the winding course of a river. The symbolum of the church is the aquae doctrinae, corresponding to the wonder-working divine water of alchemy, whose double aspect is represented by Mercurius. The healing and renewing properties of this symbolical water, whether it be Tao, the baptismal water, or the elixir, point to the therapeutic character of the mythological background from which this idea comes. Physicians who were versed in alchemy had long recognized that their arcanum healed, or was supposed to heal, not only the diseases of the body, but also those of the mind. Similarly, modern psychotherapy knows that though there are many interim solutions, there is at bottom of every neurosis a moral problem of opposites that cannot be solved rationally, and can be answered only by a superordinate third, by a symbol which expresses both sides. This was the veritas, or theoria, for which the old physicians and alchemists strove, and they could do so only by incorporating the Christian revelation into their world of ideas. They continued the work of the Gnostics, who were, most of them, not so much heretics as theologians, and the Church Fathers in a new era, instinctively recognizing that new wine should not be put into old bottles, and that, like a snake changing its skin, the old myth needs to be clothed anew in every renewed age if it is not to lose its therapeutic effect. The problems which the integration of the unconscious sets modern doctors and psychologists can only be solved along the lines traced out by history, and the upshot will be a new assimilation of the traditional myth. This, however, presupposes the continuity of historical development. Naturally, the present tendency to destroy all tradition or render it unconscious could interrupt the normal process of development for several hundred years and substitute an interlude of barbarism. Wherever the Marxist utopia prevails, this has already happened. But a predominantly scientific and technological education, such as the usual thing nowadays, can also bring about a spiritual regression and a considerable increase of psychic disassociation. With hygiene and prosperity alone, a man is still far from health, otherwise the most enlightened and most comfortably off among us would be the healthiest. But in regard to neuroses, that is not the case at all, quite the contrary. Loss of roots and lack of tradition neuroticize the masses and prepare them for collective hysteria. Collective hysteria calls for collective therapy, which consists in abolition of liberty and terrorization. Where rationalistic materialism holds sway, states tend to develop less into prisons than into lunatic asylums. I know that was a long quote from Aion by Jung, longer than I expected the 10 pages to be. But if you enjoy the source material and find it illuminating towards Jordan Peterson's beliefs, Jordan the Alchemist Peterson, please give this video a like and subscribe. Thanks.